Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. This MP4 video has been recorded at full HD resolution of 1920 by 1080 pixels. So it should play full screen on Windows PCs, Apple Mac computers, mobile devices and also most modern televisions. Every month I put together a slideshow of my Camera Club's competition images. This allows me a unique look at images submitted by many different authors with many different skill levels and interests. Every month I see a lot of images that are 70% of the way there, but they've been let down at the image editing stage. The editing of the image seems to stop short of the best that was available, and I'm not just talking about newer photographers either. Now I admit that does sound a rather arrogant thing to say, and many would defend their position by saying it's all subjective anyway, and who's to say that I'm right, which is a fair point. All that I can do is to point to my own photo galleries and also 23 years of Photoshop skills as evidence, but I can also put my money where my mouth is and demonstrate what I mean. We need technical skills to capture a great shot. We need image editing skills to develop that shot. But we also need to know what makes a good picture, or we have no direction to follow, and we sometimes stop short of the best. So the image we've been looking at for the last minute or two in Adobe Camera Raw is probably not the most dynamic you've ever seen, but I think we can push our image editing with this image far enough to create something worthwhile. If you look up at the metadata just underneath the histogram at the top of the palette on the right hand side, you can see that this was quite late in the day because I've used a 4-second exposure at f22. Now there's no neutral density filters been used here, this is just natural light. But you can also see, because of the time of day, we've got quite a blue cast within the image. This isn't uncommon, and I see this quite often in Camera Club competitions and elsewhere. The problems with the blue we can see here is that if we try to enhance some of the other colors, let's say with the vibrance, we just make that blue so intense that it virtually destroys the image. But there's such an easy way we can deal with this. Let me reset the vibrance and begin the manipulations by going to my lens correction section first of all to remove chromatic aberration and also to enable the profile corrections. What's happening here is Adobe Camera Raw has just identified the make and model of my lens. It knows what the distortion of that lens is because it's already measured, and it provides a profile. If we tick and untick, you can see the slight change that's made. Not significant, but it can sometimes be quite good to straighten up those curved horizons where we have used wide-angle lenses. Let me go back to the basic tab for a moment, and the next stage is to deal with the problem of blue here. Now I didn't see this amount of blue when I was looking through the camera. If I had, I probably wouldn't have been inspired to take the shot in the first place. There was a lot more warmth and colour in this shot. Well, if we go up to the top left at the options along the top, what we're looking for is the white balance tool. As soon as I select that, look around the image for an area that should be white. Try to avoid any burned out areas, but we don't have none of those here. But if I go to the water, for example, and click just once, look at the difference that it's made. The colour balance is now back more or less as I saw it on the evening. Now of course it doesn't mean that we have to stay with that colour balance. We can always warm it up slightly or cool it down using the temperature control here to suit our own personal views. But I happen to think it's not a bad starting point So I'm going to move on from this position by increasing the vibrance. I think I'll push quite a bit of colour into the shot. I'm going to increase the clarity too, always one of my favourites. I'm looking up at the histogram. Everything looks okay there. I'm not too worried about the sky at the moment. I'm concentrating more on the foreground. I think I can squeeze a little bit of black in there to give a bit more impact. Maybe even lift the whites a little bit just to give a bit more contrast. We can always turn on the clipping warning there. Don't worry about this. We're going to deal with this in a moment. I'm looking more in the foreground. So I think that looks pretty good, but I'm just looking around at the darkness of the shadows. Do I want the shadows to be that dark? Do I want to try to lift them a little bit? Well, I think that looks okay, to be honest. I may even tweak that warmth up a little bit as I'm looking at the image. So I'm going to take a little time out. I'm just going to sit back and take a look at the image and think about what I need to do next. Well, I think I need to turn my attention to the sky next, and I'm going to use the graduated filter here to help me do that. So I'm going to select it. Now I'm going to click and drag to draw out the bounding box. I'm going to start down here and drag it down to that sort of position. Now you can see that the graduated filter has picked up the last settings that were applied when I used this filter, and as it happens, by sheer chance, it's actually done a pretty good job. But in normal circumstances, I would say go inside your bounding box here, right click and reset those local settings so you can begin with all of the sliders in a neutral position and we can begin to make the changes. Now, why have I brought the gradient right the way down here? Well, the gradient's going to be somewhere around the middle. We're going to get most effect that we apply at the top here, graduating and disappearing down here. Of course, I could drag this up and we could have the graduated filter operating right from there to there, but then the graduation's going to come in around this sort of position. Well, we're all going to choose something slightly different, but I want quite a good impact at the top part of my sky. I may even decide to lift this up, and it's great, isn't it, that we can apply all these changes and still move the bounding box. But what's also good is we can hide this bounding box. So before we go to the right and start to make changes, if we touch the V key, it just takes it out of our eye line and allows us to concentrate on the editing we want to do. So what is that editing? Well, I think perhaps we can have a look at dropping the highlights down. That does a little. The exposure is going to do the most. But I think if we add some blue as well, we get quite a nice effect in the sky. Now I don't want to go too far with this, but I quite like what I'm seeing there. I don't want to make the yellows of the horizon over the top. Quite often when we see the colours tweaked in a shot like this, we make the yellow far too obvious and it's not natural. I like to keep it as natural as possible. But that picture is not looking too bad, but maybe I'd like a little bit more darkness at the top. When you look at the bottom of the picture, we've got quite a heavy base, not only with rocks but with much darker tones. So I've become quite a fan of adding more than one gradient, and a second gradient at the top maybe will hold the top of the image in nicely and help the overall balance. Now it can get just a little bit confusing at times when we've hit the V key and we've hidden the gradient tool overlay there, so sometimes it may be best to bring it back into play. I can go to the top and just draw a new gradient, but we can also go over to the right hand side, click the box, and it just neutralizes this one and really sets up ready for the next one, which I just want to drag down at the top there. Now that is a little bit heavy. You'll notice when you pick this up here, it sometimes swings wildly one way or the other. So if you want to get this fine tuned, move over to the right. See the double linked arrow? Now it's much easier to get any critical angle that we need. Not so critical here, but quite useful to know that. I'm going to go inside, right click and reset those settings again, and I will touch the V key so that when I drop the exposure down here and a little bit more of the temperature to try to keep it in balance, you can see I've got a bit of a light area here, so perhaps if I touch the V key and just drop it down a shade more, and I think that's looking pretty good. But I think I need another timeout, so I'm just going to go up to the top left. I'll touch the zoom tool, that gets rid of everything, and once again I could sit back and just spend 15 or 20 seconds looking around the image. In my timeout I spotted quite a number of dust spots, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first of those is that this picture was taken at a time when my camera was in deep need of cleaning. It's now been done. But also I used the F22 to give me the 4 seconds to allow the movement in the surf there. So the F22 is going to make things worse. Then of course I've been a little bit heavy-handed with the sliders to darken the sky. So I've been around with my spot removal tool here, and I've dealt with most of the spots that I can see. But I'm sure there's one or two that I've missed, so I really must look again a little later. While I'm looking at the picture, there's two things which I think I'd like to do. I'd like to investigate a little bit more darkening of the picture overall, and maybe investigate if it's necessary or desirable to lift maybe the shadows a little bit in just a couple of areas here. So I'm going to take the overall exposure, just drop it a touch, not much, just a little bit. What I then may do is to pick up my radial filter, drag out that filter over the entire picture. This works a little bit like the gradient tool. We can move it around, we can hide it. As you can see, we can have it off the screen, and sometimes we do need that. We can go inside, right click, and I can find my little rocker switch on my pen, right click and reset the local settings so that I can touch the V key once again, and when I drop the exposure down for the edges, now I'm just looking at that without the distraction of that circular shape on screen. And I'm looking around carefully, and I quite like what I see. Now I'm sort of debating with myself whether I actually need to lift the shadows here a bit, and if I did, am I going to increase or introduce problems? Perhaps if I'm just careful about it. So I'm going to pick up my adjustment brush, drop my brush size down. Looking across to the right hand side, I can see the exposure is down here, so I'll just start the brushing, but you can see it's going the wrong way. So once again, we can always reset these by right clicking the little pin and reset the local correction settings, meaning just the adjustment brush. So I could lift the exposure a little bit, I could lift the shadows a little bit just in these areas, and I could just wipe across there just to lift them, holding the space bar, moving across. See, that's a little bit heavy. I'm going to hit Ctrl Z to undo that. I'm going to go over to my flow. My flow rate here is miles too high. I didn't realize it was quite as high as that. I'm going to drop it down to something like 5 or 6 even, so I can work in a much more measured way. See what I mean? It's much better to work like this. Otherwise the tools tend to run away with us. You can see I'm not having such an effect there, but it is beginning to come up. There is a tendency for us to be a little bit impatient here. It's a good idea if you can avoid that. Just bring up those tones very gently. And I think I'm at the edge of the picture. I'll hit Ctrl 0. I think that looks pretty good, although I do find the yellow up here is a little bit on the heavy side. So I think I'm going to go back to my zoom, which brings back all the normal sliders here. I'm going to go back to my basic, just drop that vibrance down a little bit maybe. Now, the trouble with dropping the vibrance down here, I like what it's done with the yellow, it looks more natural now, but having a bit more colour in the sky did seem to work quite well. So maybe I could switch to the hue, saturation and luminance and the saturation, and maybe just tweak back the blue a little bit so I get the best of both worlds. One of the last things we could do is double click the zoom tool, look into the sky, and there I can see another couple of little spots which I'll deal with in a minute, but I want to look at any of the noise in the sky. If you look really carefully you can actually see there's an element of movement in this sky, but then there probably would be with a 4-second exposure. But the noise isn't too bad, so I was going to suggest we could put a little bit of luminance into this. We could choose about 20 and it will smooth things out just a little bit, but won't do any significant damage elsewhere because it's a pretty clever tool. I'll hit Ctrl 0 and I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. Now at this stage I would be saving this as an ongoing project because I'd like to retain the fact that we have this opened up as a smart object. So the smart object status allows me to change my mind and go back into Camera Raw and make any changes that I feel are appropriate. Now on this occasion I don't think I need to make any, but it's nice to have and to keep for as long as we can. But there are some things we may want to do where it's best to move on to a standard layer. So before we do that, why not save this as a smart object and a Photoshop file? So if we change our mind tomorrow, we do have a route back into Camera Raw to make a change. But here, and because we're doing a demo, we have to move forward. So I'm going to go to the right of my thumbnail, right click and choose Rasterize. And that takes us back to a standard layer because I did spot a couple of dust marks here which I need to deal with, and of course the perfect tool to use here is the spot healing brush. One there, and there was one over here somewhere. Now there's going to be a few others, so here's a tip. Double click the zoom tool and your image will be opened up at 100%. Go to the top left of the screen. Now you can look across the image. You can touch the, or you can pick up the spot healing brush again. You can hit the space bar, move to the right, and if you see any marks which you feel need a touch, now you can deal with them. And you'll notice that when the image is moving, for reasons I'm not sure why, the spots seem to be easier to see. Not moving it too fast, just as I am here. So I'm just quartering my image here, trying to pick up every last dust mark, because there's nothing worse, is there, than thinking we've done all of these, only to spot another one just when a picture rolls off the printer or it comes up in our camera club, and the first thing the judge says is you need to deal with your dust spots, and you've already spent lots of time on it, but the judge has picked up one that you've missed. So quarter the whole picture, go over it very carefully, make sure you pick them all up. But there's just one or two small things I'd like to do here. One of those is an old favourite of mine. It's a seascape, and I want to give it a little bit more of a panoramic look, so I'm going to stretch it just a little bit. I'm going to go to my image menu, image size. I'm going to separate the link between the width and the height with the chain link just there. I'm going to make this, it's almost 19, so I'm going to say 19, 20, I'm going to make this 21, or maybe, let me look at this in pixels. I'll make it 6,000 pixels, I think. And you'll see the effect on the image. We just get that slightly wider look, which I find appealing. Now I'd like to do a little bit of work with the greens here. And I think all I need for that is maybe the sponge tool from the toolbox. There it is, down the bottom. And I need to set it to saturate colours, and a flow rate of about 10% is probably going to be okay. I just want to wipe over these areas and just lift the colours there. You'll see it's lifting the warm colours too, but it's certainly lifting the greens. Again, keeping the brush pressure or the flow fairly low, so we can do this in a really measured fashion, because it's just that little bit of green, a little bit of warmth in that middle distance, and maybe just a little bit more to balance up the yellow and a touch of the warm tones in the area of the sunset. I think it was a sunset. The only other area I'm really staring at now is a little bit down at the bottom left, and the fact that I've got a light sky leaving the frame on the right hand side. Now both of those areas are going to be fairly easy to fix. I'll zoom in on the right hand side, pick up my spot healing brush. Let's do the big one first. That's done a pretty good job. I'll make the brush a little smaller here and just paint over that area. That looks pretty good. Maybe one more touch. Now down at the bottom left, I'm going to pick up my burn tool. I'm going to use shadows and about 5%. I need a brush which is quite large. I think I'll drop the size of the image down just a little bit so I can sweep on from outside the image. And there you can see the sort of thing I want to do, very delicate, but just hold in the tones in that area, maybe that extreme corner, and right down at the bottom a little slither that's drawing my attention. I'll just take that down too, and I think we'll call it a day. The only other thing that I did think of mentioning was we do have a number of ships right on the horizon. Now I think this is going to be a personal choice whether we leave all of those. I think it's nice to have the odd one because it does give the whole thing scale, but it's very easy to remove those you don't want. And perhaps now looking at it again, perhaps there are one or two ships there that we could do with sinking, I think. Not literally. Which one do we want to keep? Well, we could keep this one here. So I'm going to get rid of this one and the others. Let's zoom in. Should be pretty easy with the spot healing brush. No problem there. A couple of little lights on the horizon. That's the one we're going to leave, but there's another one there. Must have been a busy day for shipping. We're very close to Brisbane here, so probably not surprising. This is the shipping route in. A couple of more spots in the sky, look, that I've missed, and a bit more there. And I think there we have it. Now I do have rather an open sky in my picture, so I could introduce a few birds just flying in a strategic spot, because it does just help to fill that expanse of blue sky. I've opened up one which I've created some time before, just a flock of geese. Just the magic wand selection tool, remove the sky. So I can click, drag and drop with my move tool into my picture. I can decide to have them flying into the picture, so I can flip them over, edit, transform, flip horizontal. They need to be much smaller, so I can do that with my free transform tool, Control T. There's my birds flying now right up in a nice strategic place. But you can see there's a problem with them where they're not quite balanced with the image itself. So I'm going to go to my layers. There's the flock of geese. First thing I'm going to do is to lock the layer, and I'm going to flood these with black. Black is my foreground colour. Alt backspace. There's my flock of geese. I'll have a look at this Control 0. I think they're a little bit too dense now. So what I can do, I'm going to remove that lock by just clicking it. I can drop the opacity just a touch, so the birds start to take on a little bit of a look of blue, which is a sort of natural thing we'd expect if they was actually shot in the sky. But I think there's rather too many birds there. I'd like to thin out my flock just a little bit, and I'm going to do that with my eraser. So I'll get rid of that one, these, and I'll just keep that nice L shape as the birds are flying home to roost. Now I've just saved this image as a Photoshop file so that I've got the basic seascape and the birds separately saved, just in case I look at the image in the cold light of tomorrow and then realise it wasn't such a good idea to put the birds in the sky. Well, I can easily remove them. But for the purpose of our video, I'm going to suggest that I'm happy with the picture. Let's take a look at the original. As I always say when I do a comparison like this, it's not entirely fair to compare an untouched raw file with a completed image. But I think this raw file does demonstrate that even our most expensive cameras don't always get it right. We've got a very strong blue cast here, and these are the things where the photographer has to step in and make things right. So I think we've taken a picture that would be very easy to bypass if we saw it amongst a bunch of other thumbnails, but it's got some merits. We've got the stones leading us in, we've got just a nice bit of movement, we've got a delicate bit of colour, we've got a nice blend here between warm tones and cool tones, and I think it works rather well. But then again, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think it is a massive improvement on the image we started with. By knowing the limitations of our image editor and ourselves and getting the best from the image. Thank you for watching, and I hope the video was helpful in some way. Don't forget that I do produce a monthly newsletter, and that also contains at least one video on a photographic subject. And we also have a dedicated photo forum at www.beckhamforum.com.au. Why not come along and join us?